Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we're diving into cement, a material that underpins every road, every railway, every school, hospital, bridge and home that we build. Because without it, the UK's infrastructure ambitions would quite literally crumble. Well, my guest today is Dr. Diana Casey, Executive Director for Cement, Energy and Climate at the Mineral Products Association. And as she knows only too well, cement may not grab the headlines in a way that perhaps high-speed rail or offshore wind does, but it is the backbone of our built environment. And right now, the UK faces a major challenge. As the Labour government pushes ahead with its ambitious target to deliver 1.5 million homes over the next Parliament, alongside significant infrastructure pipeline, the question is simple. Do we have the cement we need? And if not, where will it come from? Well, the Mineral Products Association, representing the UK cement producers, warns that domestic manufacturing has become increasingly uncompetitive in the face of high costs, leading to imports tripling over the past 2 decades. And relying on overseas supply exposes us to volatile global markets, supply chain disruption, and of course the risk of project delays. Well, it also means losing out on skilled, well-paid jobs in the regions where cement is made. So, what needs to change to secure the UK's cement future and to secure it with the all-important lower carbon footprint demanded by our net zero targets? So let's find out a bit more. Diana, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be here.
Well, let's start with some of the challenges facing the sector, Diana. I mean, Labour's target, as I said, 1.5 million homes in the next 5 years alongside this massive 725 billion infrastructure pipeline. So give us some numbers. How much cement will the UK actually need to deliver that?
Yes, it's going to be quite a lot, that's for sure. So MPA estimates that if you take a typical 4-bedroom family house, for example, that will require between 3 to 5 tonnes of cement, which doesn't sound a lot until you scale it up to 1.5 million homes. And then you're looking at kind of 4.5 to 7.5 million tonnes of cement. And of course, as you mentioned in your introduction, it's not just new housing that's going to require cement. We're going to need water and energy infrastructure, nuclear power stations, for example, wind turbine bases, roads, bridges, railways, etc. And those projects are going to need an uninterrupted access to cement if the infrastructure strategy is to be effective.
So I suppose the question is, I mentioned that imports tripling over the past 2 decades. I mean, where's this cement going to come from? I mean, how much of it can realistically be sourced from UK manufacturers?
So our reliance on imported cement has grown, and that's threatening materials security, which is a concern. Cement imports into the UK, as you mentioned, they've tripled in the last 20 years and now make up 32% of the market. And that's a consequence of UK producers facing some of the highest industrial electricity prices in the world and things like uneven carbon regulation. It's also worth noting here that the MPA's latest UK cement production data, which we actually released yesterday, the 3rd of September, shows that domestic production is at its lowest level in 75 years. And that threatens the feasibility of the government's housing and infrastructure ambitions. But to answer your question, domestic production is currently around 7 million tonnes of cement a year. And given that that's the lowest production since 1950, there is more capacity there to be called on to meet demand.
Yeah. Well, that was my next question. I mean, obviously there are reasons, cost and carbon, etc., that cement is being imported. But do we actually have the capacity? We've got 7 million tonnes at the moment. What would you estimate the capacity is? Do we have the capacity to meet the demand?
So, as I said, we have more capacity that can be switched on today. And I think with the right policy environment to draw investment into the UK, we can meet the demand.
Right. Well, cement production is a highly carbon intensive operation. It's one of the so-called hard to abate sectors. I mean, your job title of Executive Director for Cement, Energy and Climate really underlines the need to acknowledge this reality. So what's happening to reduce the carbon impact of the cement industry right now?
So, I mean, you're absolutely right. The sector is very carbon intensive, but it's also deeply committed to reducing emissions. We published a roadmap back in 2020 setting out exactly how that can be achieved. And since 1990, huge investments have already been made in things like fuel switching, using byproducts and waste from other sectors to create new cement formulations that are lower carbon, and improving things like energy efficiency. We're actually, in the next couple of weeks, about to release a progress report showing that sector efforts to date have resulted in a 63% reduction in emissions since 1990, which is a really good achievement for a hard-to-abate sector. But decarbonisation also brings huge benefits beyond just the reduction of emissions. So, for example, investing in things like carbon capture will increase and create new jobs. Around 60 new jobs are required to run a carbon capture plant, adding to the roughly sort of 200 that are already required on the cement plants at the moment.
Well, I'm quite intrigued, Dana, because obviously there's a balance between reducing carbon and importing cement. Is it better from a carbon perspective to produce cement in the UK? Obviously, you don't have to transport it so far, but there are issues around, where the energy comes from. How do you make that balance between whether it's more carbon efficient to produce in the UK or actually to import it?
So it depends on how you look at it. So if you look at the UK inventory of emissions, it's all based on what is produced here. So, of course, if you export that production, then it will look like the UK is reducing its emissions. But what it's actually doing is we need cement. It's got to come from somewhere. So it's not like we're going to reduce emissions and reduce our consumption. That consumption is going to remain. Now, what you're doing is you're reducing UK emissions, but you're exporting the emissions problem abroad to a country that might not be as able to address its decarbonisation. So you could be importing higher carbon cement. And then, of course, you've got the transport emissions as well, because shipping, etc., is not decarbonised yet either.
So that's one of the risks, I suppose, of it being dependent on imported cement. Are there other risks that you see? Is it a cost factor?
I think there's several risks. Firstly, relying on imports increases the risk that they can be easily diverted elsewhere, leaving the UK without this vital product. Secondly, as we just mentioned, those imports could be sourced from countries with no climate-related policies and no incentive to decarbonise. So for construction companies that are looking to reduce their emissions through the use of decarbonised concrete and cement, these may not be low-carbon products that they're importing. And then finally, I think ultimately the risk to the UK is that it won't be able to deliver the infrastructure strategy without a secure domestic supply of cement. And we're aiming to have a secure domestic supply of low carbon cement, which is even better.
Yeah. Well, that is the key thing. Given the supply chain constraints, what really could happen to project timelines and costs if imports are disruptive or we don't really kind of ignite our domestic production? Could these projects be delayed?
Yes, and we've actually already experienced what can happen. So if you take COVID, for example, the lockdowns meant that construction stopped, at least the first lockdown, the larger lockdown, and the cement plants paused production as a consequence. Imports were diverted elsewhere. And then as we sort of eased out of those lockdowns, suddenly construction came to life again and there were cement shortages because we couldn't keep up with the demand and the imports weren't just magically there at the click of a button kind of thing. So we saw price spikes and supplies had to be rationed. It was discussed in some of the higher levels of government even, and this definitely isn't a situation we want to see repeated.
Yeah. Well, clearly there's a lot to get stuck into for something like the Mineral Products Association. But for those unfamiliar, what exactly does it do? What does the association do? Why is it so important to the UK economy right now?
So we're quite unique as an organisation and a trade association within our sector because we represent the whole mineral products sector, from aggregates, asphalt and dimension stone to cement, concrete, lime and industrial sands. Production of mineral products in the UK actually represents the largest material flow at 400 million tonnes of product every year.
Right.
Our members also employ over 80,000 people at kind of thousands of sites all across the country, including in some more rural areas. So where they offer a main source of employment. So it's really important for construction and the economy as a whole.
So cement's just one part of it. You've got aggregates, you've got a whole range of different materials. But would you say cement for you is kind of like up there as the big thing on your radar right now then?
Cement for me definitely is, because it's the more carbon intensive product within
and it's in your job title, but I meant for the Mineral Products Association in general.
Definitely. I mean, there's other issues across the association as well, and we're trying to tackle everything from planning and landfill tax and aggregates levy to the energy costs and carbon impacts on our sector. So yeah, it's quite a broad ranging remit.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about minerals, whether they are cement or aggregates, it's very much a global market though, as well as a whole lot of domestic policy which is involved. I mean, how do you make that balance and help your members to navigate what is a very sophisticated market out there?
So we act as a single voice, which then makes us more powerful as a sector when it comes to influencing government policy. We have a range of technical experts and advocacy specialists who work on behalf of the sector to persuade government, I suppose, to create a policy environment that enables our members to thrive and to grow and help the government deliver its missions, providing highly skilled, well-paid jobs as well.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of consolidation in the market. I say there's a lot of global businesses because there's some huge multinationals that are involved in that whole business, but there's also many smaller, more regional producers. Are you more pro the smaller ones, or are you helping the where do you target your influence?
So we, as a single voice, all our members are really important, and many of the issues that affect companies are the same, whether they're large or small. Now, it's important for us to get out, to meet with our members and to understand their individual concerns as well. From a carbon and energy and cement perspective, that does tend to be the larger companies that are operating and who I personally spend a lot of my time working with. I
mean, that clearly your role really is focused largely on helping the industry to cut the carbon impact of cement. Give us some specifics. What are you actually doing to do that? Give us some specific initiatives you're involved in right now.
Yeah, so I suppose on the carbon side, we often see government trying to pile on costs as a sort of stick to force decarbonisation. But for cement, that kind of, you'll get the low-hanging fruit of, some fuel switching or some changes to cement formulations, but it's not going to tackle things like carbon capture. Instead, you can force deindustrialisation. So we get what we talked about earlier, that sort of decarbonisation by offshoring our emissions rather than actually tackling them. So some of the things we're looking at the moment are changes to the UK emissions trading scheme, for example, to make sure that it does incentivise decarbonisation. And beside that, we do need this carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I think you mentioned in your introduction too. Well,
perhaps talk about that in a moment. I know that the organisations like Mission Possible Partnership, for instance, are really kind of trying to bring the whole global supply chain into line and helping there. But lots and lots of huge challenges there. I mean, you've been with the MPA for around about 15 years in various roles focused on the need to reduce the carbon impact of cement production. I mean, what's your background then, Diana? What drew you into minerals and cement?
So my first introduction to the sector was in my final year at university. I had a final year project all lined up. I was doing a physics degree, and at the last minute it was cancelled. So I was kind of sent off around the university to speak to different professors to try and find an alternative project. And I came across a sort of slightly unusual department in the University of Bristol that was doing more commercial work than teaching, to be honest. And they were looking at lime mortars. So they had a project. They were happy to take me on as a sort of final year project and dissertation. And it was a very steep learning curve for someone studying physics, but I really enjoyed it. And having completed that and also swearing I would never, ever do a PhD, it just so happened that some funding for a PhD was available. So I continued the research and I was looking at using different waste materials to produce lime mortar, including things like eggshells, for example. So that's kind of what got me started.
Oh right, no, what that and it's built from there and there because you joined the Environment Agency initially, I think, and I think you worked as an information scientist. I mean, what's that?
Yes, so that was slightly different. It was more of a kind of a literature review, data analysis, research type role. So I would research anything and everything for any Environment Agency employee, and then present that as evidence for them to make their informed regulatory decisions. So, I mean, the topics you could get asked to look at were wide-ranging, from mining waste to nuclear power to fisheries. It was quite incredible.
Just basically giving them the facts that they can base policy around. I mean, what motivates you right now? You've moved from, I suppose you started off, looking at eggshells and doing the science of it and really getting stuck into the actual formulation of cement. But what motivates you now to advocate for UK manufacturing and material security, and get stuck into that policy area?
Well, I like a challenge, and decarbonising cement seems like a good one to spend my time tackling. But I think more seriously, cement really is fundamental to our world. While in the UK and other parts of the developed world, we use concrete to build incredible structures, in the global south, a concrete floor can really make a real difference to people's lives by simply improving their health. So it's just so important. And as a sector, we do have our work cut out for us to decarbonise, but I think it's worth it for such a fundamentally vital material. And it feels like something I can spend my time, I can invest my time in.
Well, it is incredible, really, when you think how cement, concrete has been at the heart of the development of the built environment for thousands of years. Is there nothing new? Is there nothing new coming on the horizon? When will we have an alternative to cement?
Well, I think there's alternatives being worked on all the time. So just last year, we updated the concrete standard to include new cement formulations that are lower carbon. And those were allowing us to mix combinations of materials that are actually already used, but mix them together. We've got another update, which we're looking at, calcined clay, which is quite topical. It's in the sort of cement world news quite a lot. And we're looking at other things like recycled concrete fines. So taking the cement paste out of construction and demolition waste and trying to reuse that. So research and innovation, it continues.
So what you're saying is that not all cement is the same.
Exactly.
There has been evolution. Well, you're based in Bristol. I mean, I can't think you get up to anything else other than think about concrete and cement and concrete the whole of your life. But no, you must do. What else do you do when you're not thinking about it?
I think I spend the majority of the rest of my life trying to keep up with my husband and my 10-year-old twins, who I sent off to school today for their first year of year 6.
Congratulations.
So they definitely keep me on my toes. But I really enjoy being outdoors. I do loads of walking, and I'm just back from a wonderful family holiday in the mountains of Austria, actually, which was just fabulous.
Very good, and I imagine that you fascinate your family the whole time by pointing out concrete structures all the time.
Yeah, well, concrete structures, and pointing out that you get concrete mixers on the road and not cement mixers, and they've had that drilled into them from a very young age.
Oh my Lord! Well, don't go to the US. They're very confused about it in the US, that's for sure. Anyway, back to cement. I mean, cement imports, as we said, they've tripled in the past 20 years. I mean, we've talked about what's driving that shift, but I mean, do you see that changing?
Only if we can change some of the policy that the reason for the shift has been the UK sector being rendering a bit uncompetitive as a consequence of things like high electricity costs, uneven global carbon pricing. We've also got very high labour and business costs in the UK compared to the rest of the world. Now, if we can address some of these issues, then absolutely, I think we can reverse that trend.
I mean, the high production costs and the high power costs we've seen in the UK. Would you say that is the main issue then?
It's one of them. To be honest, there's a cumulative burden of costs that kind of get piled on industry. The electricity price is definitely one. And the challenge is that these high costs and this cumulative burden of costs can't really be passed through to consumers because that domestic production then gets undercut by cheaper imports. I think the other challenge with some of this, though, is that when you're not as competitive, it's hard to attract internal investment here from some of those multinational companies that we talked about earlier. So, that investment will flow to where multinationals can get the best rate of return. And if the UK isn't competitive, it will go elsewhere.
Yeah. I mean, do you think the UK public and policymakers really understand the kind of things you're talking about at MPA and the importance of material security?
I feel that material security is often very much taken for granted. And even when there are issues, such as the example I gave around COVID and the challenges faced after, they're very quickly forgotten again until you hit another one, and then suddenly it's like, panic. So there is an element of having to persuade and remind people what can happen if we don't address some of the issues.
Yeah. I ran a podcast last week about HS2, and of course HS2 post-COVID and post-Ukrainian war has been suffering from an awful lot of materials price inflation. Presumably, we are vulnerable to global cement price volatility. That will impact major UK projects, presumably, by putting prices up and slowing things down.
I think it can. And, if imports continue to increase their market share, then we'll become more and more vulnerable to that global price volatility. I think the other challenge we have to be aware of is that there are a number of war-torn countries, like Ukraine, for example. Now, if they all start to rebuild and the demand for cement increases, then we could start to see the UK having to pay more to bring the cement here. And that's why a strong domestic sector could try and help mitigate some of that risk.
But it's not just about economics, Diana. It's about helping the government to meet its mission for growth and generating more jobs and boosting regional economies in the UK. Do you see that happening? Is that the ultimate aim?
Yes, so it's a really important point. So cement production is located at 10 plants situated in all 4 nations of the UK and often in rural areas. So the plants provide much needed, highly skilled and well-paid jobs to those communities. These jobs are also some of the most productive across the economy, with each cement worker adding £191,000 of value annually, which is nearly 3 times the national average. And this is another reason why it really is just so important to keep domestic production here in the UK.
I mean, a bit radical perhaps, but should the UK contractors be required to pass some kind of British jobs test for materials sourcing?
I think so. One of our main asks of government is a public procurement policy that puts domestic production first. This would also help rebuild producers' confidence in the UK market. Now, 75% of supply chain purchases for cement come from UK businesses, so it really would be an own goal not to prioritise domestic procurement and invest money back into the economy.
Yeah, well, I mean, that does take us to this whole issue, and we talk an awful lot about public procurement reform, and we've got the advent of NISTA, the National Infrastructure Service Transformation Authority, which is now at the heart of trying to make sure that we're procuring properly. I mean, how can public procurement be used to protect and promote UK cement manufacturing?
So I think it's prioritising domestic production and putting those jobs that we mentioned first. It also, by doing that, you help generate a kind of critical mass of demand that also helps to provide the confidence to invest. And if that demand is also for low carbon products, it gives the right signals to the producers that the UK is the place to invest and produce those materials here. It's all kind of around confidence building for them to invest.
Yeah, I mean, that obviously starts with consistent public policy, and I suppose that's what people like NISTA are trying to create. You mentioned it earlier, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Well, tell us about that. What is it, and how urgent is it to implement such a watertight mechanism?
So the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, because I'll shorten it, is a sort of new policy idea to level the carbon cost playing field. So that imports are charged a tax when they come into the UK that is equivalent to what domestic producers pay in the UK emissions trading system for emitting carbon dioxide in production. So it's one way to help level that playing field that we mentioned that's putting domestic producers at a competitive disadvantage. So for us, this is getting really urgent given the sort of the competitiveness issues, but also because the EU is implementing a similar scheme, and a year earlier, so they're introducing their scheme fully from the 1st of January 2026. The UK is looking at 2027. So the threat is that cement bound for the EU could be diverted to the UK, where for that year it wouldn't have to pay a carbon price. So we do see this as being quite urgent.
Sounds a bit like a tariff to me, Diana. To use a populist term.
I think it is similar. It's a tax on carbon. Yeah.
You also mention the ability of carbon capture and storage to really transform our approach by actually reducing the carbon impact of the energy that we use. I mean, what role could government play in supporting those kind of plants that are, maybe are attached directly to cement plants?
Yeah, so carbon capture really is essential to the decarbonisation of cement because it has a high proportion of process emissions. So fuel switching won't tackle them. Carbon capture is the only option. Now, the technology for carbon capture is currently expensive because it's only been deployed so far at one cement plant. So the Brevik plant in Norway started operating with CCS this summer. And it's not currently possible for a cement plant to deploy carbon capture and produce competitively priced cements because the decarbonisation action is not the same across other parts of the world. And so at the moment, we do need some support. Now, that support can come in several different forms. There's a business model, which is financial support, that's currently being offered to some of the earlier projects, which is a sort of 10 to 15 year contract to support with operating costs. However, longer term, I think there really is a need to grow demand for lower carbon products from buyers who are willing to pay a little bit more for them. And again, that will give confidence to invest here.
Are you looking also at government introducing some kind of subsidies for contractors or clients who insist upon a lower carbon cement?
So that's not something we've looked at, I have to say. The other thing I did want to point out is that while we might be asking for support from government, there is millions of pounds coming from the companies themselves as well. This is, these are significant investments that we're looking at making. Lots
and lots of ideas that are coming across your desk there, Diana, in terms of decarbonising cement. Are we moving fast enough? I mentioned it's a hard to abate sector, but are we moving fast enough towards this future net zero cement production?
In some regions, the answer is definitely yes. In others, the answer is no. So we have one plant that I suppose you could say won the geographical lottery because it's located in a Track 1 cluster. So the Track 1 and Track 2 clusters are sort of clusters of industry that have been prioritised by government for financial support for carbon capture. In the cement sector, we also have the world's largest cement and lime carbon capture project in the UK. So it's known as Peak Cluster. And that's recently received support from the National Wealth Fund for sort of further detailed design work, including a pipeline which will take around 3 million tonnes of CO2 from the site to Morecambe Bay, where it will be stored. But we also have other cement plants that we call dispersed sites. So they're not located in industrial clusters. They tend to be more isolated, and they might even be the only bit of industry in a load of countryside almost. More definitely needs to be done to support those plants to decarbonise. And that could be things like developing a CO2 transport network, so a carbon dioxide transport network, so that they can start to think about how they might be able to connect to it, whether by a pipeline or by non-pipeline options like a train, for example. Another option might be some support towards funding for feasibility studies, just to accelerate their, looking at these things. And I think that's really what we're looking for in terms of support. But there's definitely more that could be done.
And are there any single policy changes that you think might help level the playing field between domestic producers and imports?
I think this is a difficult one because it comes back to that sort of cumulative burden of cost impacts that I mentioned earlier, which means a single change may not be enough to level the playing field entirely. I think a package of measures are required. I think my top two would be the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, to help level the carbon cost, and the procurement policy that prioritises low carbon British products. Those would be my top two, I think.
But of course, it's politically, things move very, very fast, particularly in the net zero world. There are critics also that argue that protecting UK cement production and trying to offset the costs of reducing carbon could lead to higher construction costs. I presume you disagree with that.
I think there is a potential risk. You can't decarbonise without spending some money, and that's got to come from somewhere. But there's just the economic benefits, I think, override some of these concerns. The growth that decarbonisation could bring, particularly in our sector, I talked about the increase in jobs, for example, I think is really important. But also ensuring that we have a domestic sector will also mitigate the risk of those global cement price volatility issues that we talked about earlier. And it also gives the UK control over the decarbonisation of the materials going into construction. So while there are risks, I think there are also risks of not doing it, which to me are bigger.
Okay. Well, just drawing us to a couple of final points. I mean, what lessons do you think the UK can learn from other countries that maybe have had success in protecting their domestic cement manufacturing industries?
So for me, I don't think it's about taking lessons from others, actually, because often the countries with competitive cement manufacture are those that are subsidising fossil fuel use and not putting any cost on carbon, which means then there's no incentive to decarbonise. And that's absolutely not what we're asking the UK to do. We believe it's possible for a thriving UK domestic cement sector that's producing net zero cement. However, to achieve that, we do need the UK to do things like reforming the electricity pricing, to take advantage of the increasing use of cheap renewables in power generation. And we need to make sure that those imports face an equal cost of carbon until they are equally incentivised to decarbonise. So I think that's what we're asking. Well,
finally then, Diana, I mean, if you had 5 minutes with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, both who are scratching around, really trying to find ways to drive growth, to deliver our infrastructure more efficiently and more effectively and reduce our carbon footprint. I mean, what would your number one ask be for the cement industry right now?
So we really need the Chancellor, the Prime Minister and all of government to really recognise the fundamental importance of the cement sector to delivering their missions and economic growth. And therefore to want to take action to ensure the sector is competitive and is supported to decarbonise. Right,
we shall see with the budget's just around the corner. Who knows what might be in store to try to incentivise that. But thanks so much for joining me today on the Infrastructure Podcast, Diana. It's a really interesting conversation. I mean, some great insights, huge challenges facing the sector, but as you point out, there are really, really great opportunities to really help tackle some of the things which are core to this government's agenda, but also core to our built environment right now. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. That's all we've got time for today, unfortunately, but we have more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Diana, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.